Disclaimer.
Breaking news in the search for a missing college student from Atlanta. GBI just confirming they have found Anitra Gunn's body in Crawford County. That's in the Macon area.
The Fort Valley State senior had not been seen in 5 days. 11 Alive's Latasha Givens has the very latest.
On the morning of February 14th, 2020, a 23-year-old college senior picked up her phone and called her father just to wish him a happy Valentine's Day. It was a small, loving gesture. The kind of ordinary phone call that happens thousands of times a day across the country. By that evening, her friends could not reach her. By the next day, her family had reported her missing. And by the time investigators finally found her, 4 agonizing days later, in a quiet wooded area outside a small Georgia town, what they discovered confirmed everyone's worst fear. Her name was Anitra Gunn, a promising agriculture major with a beautiful singing voice. And the answer to what happened to her on that Valentine's Day would ultimately be found not in the words of a stranger, but in the phone of someone who claimed to love her the most. Before we continue, hit subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss one of these stories. Now, let's step into Fort Valley, Georgia. Anitra Gunn was born in Camp Hill, Alabama, and spent part of her early childhood in nearby Dadeville before her family eventually relocated to the Atlanta area. She graduated from Westlake High School in 2016, and by the time she reached her senior year, she had built a life defined by purpose and ambition. Enrolled at Fort Valley State University, a historically black institution roughly 30 miles outside Macon, Georgia, where she was working toward a degree as an agriculture major. Those who knew her described a young woman who was warm, disciplined, and deeply connected to her campus community. She sang in not one, but 2 of the university's choirs. A small but telling detail that speaks to just how fully she had embraced college life and the community around her. Professors and classmates who later spoke about her consistently used the same handful of words: driven, kind, someone who showed up, someone who genuinely cared about the people around her, exactly the kind of student any university would point to with pride. To her family, especially her father, Christopher, Anitra was simply his daughter, someone he stayed in close, consistent contact with. Even while she lived hours away pursuing her education, that closeness would ultimately become one of the very first threads investigators pulled on once concern began to grow. Because Anitra Gunn was not the kind of person who simply disappeared without explanation. She called, she texted, she stayed in touch, which made her sudden silence, beginning on the afternoon of February 14th, immediately alarming to everyone who knew her well. By the time of her disappearance, Anitra had been in a relationship with a 23-year-old named DeMarcus Little. On the surface, Little presented himself as an upstanding young man. He was a soldier in the United States Army, stationed at Fort Gordon, someone with what his own defense attorney would later describe during his very first court appearance as an impressive military background. But underneath that respectable exterior, the relationship between Anitra and DeMarcus had, according to evidence that would later surface, been growing increasingly volatile and dangerous in the weeks leading up to her death. Text messages exchanged between the two of them, later read at length during his trial, painted a picture of a relationship that swung unpredictably between affection and conflict, with Little frequently expressing an intensity of feeling toward Anitra that friends would later describe in hindsight as consuming rather than healthy. Just 9 days before Anitra vanished, on February 5, 2020, something happened that, in hindsight, reads as an unmistakable warning sign. The windows of Anitra's apartment were smashed, and the tires of her car were slashed. According to authorities, this act of vandalism and intimidation was allegedly carried out by DeMarcus Little himself. At the time, it resulted only in a charge of criminal damage to property, a relatively minor offense compared to what investigators would eventually uncover. But viewed through the lens of everything that followed, that single incident stands out as a clear, documented escalation. A young man expressing anger and a desire for control through property destruction, less than 2 weeks before his girlfriend would disappear entirely. What makes this part of the story so difficult to sit with is how familiar this particular pattern is. An intimate partner relationship that outwardly appears stable, even admirable. Given Little's military service and clean public reputation, while privately cycling through episodes of anger, intimidation, and escalating volatility, friends and family members who later testified at trial would describe a relationship far more complicated and troubled than anyone outside of it had fully understood. Anitra had, in the days and weeks before her death, reportedly been trying to establish some distance from DeMarcus, a decision that, tragically, would not be honored. Instead of accepting that distance, evidence would eventually show that DeMarcus Little's response to feeling rejected by the woman he claimed to love more than anything in the world would prove catastrophic, setting in motion the final, devastating hours of Anitra Gunn's life. Criminologists who study intimate partner violence often point to exactly this window, the period immediately following a woman's attempt to create distance or end a relationship, as statistically among the most dangerous moments in any relationship marked by controlling or possessive behavior. A pattern that, tragically, this case would go on to illustrate in the most devastating way imaginable. Friday, February 14, 2020, began like any other Valentine's Day for Anitra Gunn. That morning, she picked up the phone and called her father, Christopher, simply to wish him a happy holiday. A small, thoughtful gesture that neither of them could have known would become one of the very last conversations they would ever share. Around 11:30 that morning, Anitra was seen near Chestnut Hill Road, just outside the city limits of Fort Valley, going about what appeared, to anyone watching, to be an entirely ordinary day. Students who lived nearby later recalled nothing unusual about that late morning. No raised voices, no visible confrontation, simply a normal Friday unfolding in a small college town. The kind of unremarkable moment that so often precedes tragedy without ever giving anyone around it the slightest warning of what is actually about to happen. Then, seemingly without explanation, the silence began. Calls from friends went unanswered, texts sat unread. For a young woman known for staying in close, consistent contact with the people in her life, this abrupt disconnection immediately struck those closest to her as deeply unusual. By Saturday, with still no word from Anitra, her family made the difficult decision to contact local authorities, telling police they had been unable to reach her for what they described as an unusual amount of time, a phrase that, in retrospect, carried far more weight than anyone initially realized. Investigators moved quickly, and what they found only deepened the growing sense of alarm. Over the course of that same weekend, Fort Valley police located Anitra's white 2013 Chevrolet Cruze. But the car was not simply parked and abandoned. Its front bumper had been torn completely off, a jarring, visible sign that something violent may have occurred. Adding to the unsettling picture, Anitra's father would later confirm to reporters that her wallet was still sitting inside that car, and her cell phone was recovered nearby as well. Two items that anyone planning to walk away from their own life would almost certainly have taken with them. That single detail, the damaged bumper sitting silently in a residential yard, quickly became the visual centerpiece of the entire search. A stark physical piece of evidence that transformed public concern from a routine missing persons case into something investigators clearly understood, from very early on, was likely far more sinister. As word of Anitra's disappearance spread, the response from law enforcement escalated rapidly. The Georgia State Patrol deployed its aviation team, helicopters sweeping the skies above Fort Valley and the surrounding countryside, searching for any visible sign of where Anitra might be. On the ground, the Fort Valley Police Department and the Peach County Sheriff's Office established a dedicated task force focused entirely on finding her, and the Georgia Bureau of Investigation stepped in to help process the evidence recovered from her damaged vehicle. A $5,000 reward was offered for any information that might help bring her home safely. Fort Valley State University, the close-knit campus community Anitra had called home for the better part of 4 years, responded with visible, heartfelt concern. University officials released a public statement expressing their deep worry for her well-being, pledging full cooperation with the ongoing investigation. Students and faculty who knew Anitra personally organized a candlelight vigil, gathering together in a display of hope and solidarity even as the days without any concrete answers continued to stretch on, painfully, longer and longer. Throughout that agonizing weekend and into the beginning of the following week, Anitra's father, Christopher, became the emotional center of a story playing out increasingly in the public eye. He spoke to local reporters, describing the crushing feeling of uncertainty that came with not knowing where his daughter was, especially given how consistently they had always stayed in touch. His words captured something universal about this particular kind of nightmare. The specific, grinding torment of silence where there should be an answer, of a phone that simply will not ring, no matter how many times you will it to. Meanwhile, quietly, investigators had already begun looking closely at someone much closer to Anitra than a stranger. Someone who, just over a week earlier, had already shown a documented willingness toward anger and destruction directed specifically at her. By Monday, February 17th, 3 days after Anitra was last seen, investigators had escalated the case to its highest level of urgency. The search now spanned local police, the Peach County Sheriff's Office, the Georgia Bureau of Investigation, and the state's aviation resources, all coordinated around a singular, increasingly desperate goal: finding Anitra before it was too late. Unbeknownst to the wider public at that moment, however, a critical piece of the puzzle was already sitting in a jail cell. Fort Valley Police Chief Lawrence Spurgeon, speaking to reporters during this period, emphasized in unmistakable terms exactly how seriously every agency involved was treating the case, promising that if any harm had come to Anitra, the arrest and prosecution of whoever was responsible would become the highest priority for every single department working the investigation. 2 days earlier, on February 15th, the day after Anitra vanished, authorities arrested DeMarcus Little, but not initially in connection with her disappearance. He was taken into custody for the earlier incident from February 5th, when Anitra's apartment windows had been smashed and her car tires slashed. At the time of his arrest, investigators may not have yet fully connected that earlier act of vandalism to the far more urgent, unfolding search for Anitra herself, but that connection would not remain hidden for long.
Now, this information is just coming into the newsroom within the last 15 minutes. A GBI special agent telling our sister station that Gunn's body was found by the Peach-Crawford County line, but they haven't said how she died or whether anyone is in custody.
On Tuesday, February 18th, 4 days after Anitra was last seen alive, searchers made the discovery that both confirmed and shattered every remaining hope her family and friends had been holding on to. Her body was found in a wooded area of Crawford County, Georgia, near the county line shared with Peach County, according to officials at the scene. Her remains had been partially covered, in a manner investigators described as deliberate, as if someone had specifically tried to conceal what had happened there, a detail that spoke immediately to intent, to planning, to someone attempting to buy themselves time before the truth was uncovered. Searchers reportedly located her remains only after following tracks and evidence connected to her damaged vehicle, a piece of the missing car's bumper eventually turning up roughly 150 yards off the roadway, the very same piece investigators had been searching for since Anitra's car was first recovered days earlier, quietly, leading them, step by step, directly to where she had been left. The following day, an autopsy confirmed what investigators had already suspected but could not yet officially state. The remains recovered in that wooded area belonged to Anitra Gunn. Her death was formally ruled a homicide, though her precise cause of death remained pending further toxicology results in those first uncertain days following the discovery. For a community that had spent 4 days holding on to hope, organizing search parties, sharing her photograph across social media, praying for a safe return, this news landed like an unbearable, collective gut punch. Fort Valley State University's president released a heartfelt statement on behalf of the entire campus community, offering condolences to Anitra's family, friends, and loved ones, acknowledging that her loss represented a tragedy not just for those closest to her, but for the university and the broader community she had called home. With Anitra's death now officially classified as a homicide, investigators moved swiftly. Just 3 days after her body was discovered, authorities obtained a warrant charging DeMarcus Little, already sitting in custody on the earlier vandalism charge, with malice murder. GBI officials, while declining to detail the specific evidence that led to this dramatic escalation, indicated only that there had been a significant development earlier that same day, one that finally gave them the legal foundation needed to formally charge him with taking Anitra's life. Court documents later revealed a detail that made the entire case even more difficult to comprehend. Anitra Gunn had died by strangulation, killed according to the arrest warrant, with what investigators described in chillingly clinical legal language as unlawful and malicious force applied by another person's own two hands. That phrase, unlawful and malicious force applied by another person's own two hands, carried a horrifying intimacy to it. This was not a killing carried out from a distance, with a weapon that created physical separation between predator and victim. This was violence delivered directly, hand to throat, by someone Anitra had trusted enough to let close to her in the first place. Just days after DeMarcus Little's arrest for murder, investigators revealed a disturbing twist that added an entirely new layer to the case. They had also taken a second person into custody, 22-year-old Javon Abron, a friend of Little's who also knew Anitra, according to the Georgia Bureau of Investigation. Authorities had spoken with Abron multiple times over the course of their investigation, and probable cause was ultimately established to charge him with 2 counts of making false statements to police, along with 1 count of concealing a death. Investigators did not initially elaborate publicly on exactly what role Abron may have played, but the implication was chilling. Someone else had known, at some point, exactly what had happened to Anitra and had chosen, for whatever reason, to hide that truth rather than come forward immediately. That same week, investigators recovered Anitra's cell phone and continued searching specifically for the missing bumper piece. From her car, small, individually insignificant pieces of a puzzle that, together, were steadily closing in on a complete and devastating picture of her final hours. That decision to remain silent would eventually come out in dramatic fashion during DeMarcus Little's trial, nearly 2 years after Anitra's death. When the case finally went before a jury in Peach County in March of 2022, jurors would hear devastating testimony directly from Abron himself.
I was telling my mom that I was talking to her, and she was like, trying to tell her how I feel about how, how much I love her and stuff. And he was like, she ended up laughing in my face. He was like, Brian, I don't know what happened. I just blacked out. And I don't hear it. Then he was like, when he was like, after that, like, he just grabbed her and started choking her.
According to his account, Little had confided in him that he had choked Anitra to death on Valentine's Day, telling him the confrontation began after Anitra laughed in his face when he told her he loved her. According to Abron's testimony, Little described blacking out, punching her, and then strangling her, a confession delivered not to police, but to a close friend, in the kind of unguarded private conversation someone has when they believe no one else will ever hear it. The trial itself stretched across 7 days, and prosecutors built their case using an extraordinary volume of digital evidence, pulled directly from Little's own cell phone. Assistant District Attorney Don Baskin, leading the prosecution, would later describe that phone as the single biggest witness against him. Not simply the text messages exchanged between Little and Anitra in the weeks and days before her death, though there were pages upon pages of those, but the underlying phone data itself, including GPS location information that placed him at critical times and locations connected directly to the crime. Prosecutors used that data, combined with photographs of the wooded path leading to where Anitra's body was found, to walk jurors step by step through exactly what had happened, comparing the unfolding narrative to a psychological thriller where, as Baskin put it, you could tell exactly what was coming the entire time. It was, in many ways, a case built almost entirely on the very technology Little likely carried in his own pocket every single day. An unblinking, unfiltered digital witness that had quietly recorded far more of his final hours with Anitra than he ever could have realized at the time. DeMarcus Little ultimately chose to testify in his own defense, and what jurors heard was, by most accounts, a striking display of denial in the face of overwhelming evidence. When he rose from his seat to walk toward the witness stand, Anitra's own father chose to leave the courtroom entirely, unable to sit through his testimony on the stand. Little described Anitra not as someone he had harmed, but as his soulmate, his lifeline, insisting to the jury that if she had ever truly been afraid of him, she would have stayed away rather than continuing to come back. In one particularly striking moment, he told the courtroom directly that he was not the monster people were making him out to be, insisting that if he really were, Anitra would have left him long before that Valentine's Day. The state did not offer DeMarcus Little any plea deal throughout this entire process. Prosecutors were determined to see the case through to a full trial and to let a jury weigh the complete, devastating body of evidence they had assembled. Evidence that included not just the phone data and the text messages, but testimony from witnesses who had known both Anitra and DeMarcus intimately. Her own best friend, his aunt, his closest friend, each offering a piece of the picture that, together, formed an overwhelming and largely unified portrait of what had actually happened inside that relationship. And on that Valentine's Day, when Anitra Gunn's laughter, of all things, appeared to trigger the violence that would ultimately end her life. After 7 days of testimony, the jury in Peach County retired to deliberate. And what followed happened remarkably quickly given the complexity and emotional weight of everything they had just heard. In just 3 hours, they reached their verdict. DeMarcus Little was found not guilty of malice murder, the most serious charge he faced, but guilty of felony murder, and guilty as well of aggravated assault, specifically tied to death by strangulation. For Anitra's family sitting through that verdict, it represented both an enormous relief, accountability finally arriving after 2 long years, and a bittersweet reminder that the specific label of malice murder, the charge that would have required proving Little acted with clear, premeditated intent, had ultimately fallen just short in the eyes of the jury. Legal analysts who followed the case noted that this outcome is, in fact, a fairly common one in cases involving intimate partner violence. Juries often find it easier to conclude that a defendant intended to cause serious harm than to conclude beyond a reasonable doubt that he specifically set out that day to end a life, a distinction that can feel, to grieving families, almost impossibly small given the devastating, irreversible result either way. What came next in the sentencing phase offered no such ambiguity. Judge Connie Williford heard powerful, emotional statements from Anitra's family. Her godmother stood before the court and described in devastating terms exactly what DeMarcus Little had done, choosing to put his hands around Anitra Gunn's neck and watch the life leave her body, taking a human being's life with no regard whatsoever for the devastating ripple effect it would have on everyone who loved her. She promised the court and the world that the name Anitra Gunn would never simply fade away, that her family would make absolutely certain of that. Assistant District Attorney Neil Halverson delivered the state's final argument for the maximum possible sentence, and his words, delivered with audible emotion in open court, captured the full, unbearable weight of what this case had always been about. He told the judge that the facts demanded only one appropriate sentence: life without the possibility of parole, describing in a moment of raw, unfiltered grief how Little had disposed of Anitra's body like garbage left in the woods, allowing insects to gather where her body had been abandoned. He closed with a line that would echo across headlines covering the case for days afterward, that Anitra Gunn would never again be able to breathe air on this earth, and that the only appropriate consequence was that DeMarcus Little never breathe free air again himself. Judge Williford agreed completely, sentencing DeMarcus Little to life in prison without any possibility of parole, ensuring that whatever ambiguity remained around the specific murder charge, the practical outcome for Little would be exactly the same: a lifetime spent entirely behind bars for the family and friends who had spent 2 years fighting for this moment, from the earliest desperate days of the search through a grueling week-long trial filled with painful, explicit testimony. This sentence finally offered something that had felt, for so long, entirely out of reach, a measure of closure, even if closure could never fully repair what had been taken from them. Anitra Gunn's story continues to resonate today, not simply as a cautionary tale about intimate partner violence, though it undeniably is one, but as a reminder of who she actually was before any of this happened: a promising agriculture student with a voice good enough for 2 university choirs, a devoted daughter who called her father just to wish him a happy Valentine's Day, a young woman building toward a future that should have stretched decades beyond that February afternoon. Her family has kept her memory alive in the years since, refusing to let her story be reduced to simply another statistic. And in doing exactly that, they have ensured that Anitra Gunn is remembered not for how her life ended, but for the warmth, ambition, and genuine kindness that defined every single day that came before it. Advocates who work with families of intimate partner violence victims often point to cases like this one as evidence of just how essential it is for loved ones to keep. Speaking a victim's name long after the headlines fade, a small, powerful act of resistance against the very silence and erasure that violence like this so often threatens to leave behind, and for Anitra Gunn's family, that promise, that her name would never simply disappear, remains a commitment they continue to honor to this day. That concludes today's case. If you found this documentary informative, consider subscribing and turning on notifications so you don't miss future investigations. If you have a case you'd like us to cover, leave it in the comments below. Thank you for watching. Stay curious, stay respectful, and we'll see you in the next investigation.